The evening felt like a well-earned break. Maya had always been the responsible one in the family, the one her parents trusted to look after the house when they were away. It wasn't that she didn't miss them when they were gone, but there was something liberating about having the place to herself. No strict rules, no demands. Just a few days of peace and quiet. Her parents had left for a wedding in the next town over, and while they were usually home on Sundays, this weekend would be different. They trusted Maya enough to leave her alone for 2 nights. It wasn't her first time, but something about this time felt different. Perhaps it was the strange excitement that always crept up when she was by herself. "Remember to lock the doors, Maya. Don't leave the windows open, all right," her mother had warned as she handed Maya the keys to the house. "And if you need anything, call us." "I will, Mom. Don't worry. I'm not a kid anymore." Maya smiled reassuringly. "Just promise you'll stay inside after dark. It's not safe to be outside in the neighborhood after nightfall." Her mother always seemed to think there was danger lurking everywhere, but Maya didn't mind. She was used to it. After they left, Maya took a deep breath and settled in for a quiet weekend. The house was almost too quiet, the kind of silence that settled over everything like a thick blanket. The TV was on, but it was only background noise as she sat on the couch with a cup of tea, her eyes on the screen, her mind elsewhere. She was trying to enjoy the solitude, but it felt like something was just off. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows slightly, but the occasional creak of the house settling into the night wasn't enough to cause alarm. Maya rolled her eyes at herself. "It's just the wind that I can't stop. I can't stop." Her feet splashed through puddles as she made her way down the dark street, looking over her shoulder every few steps, expecting to see the figure of the intruder following close behind. But there was nothing. She had made it out of the house, but her mind kept screaming at her that it wasn't over. She could still feel his cold gaze on her, hear his voice echoing in her mind. "You can't run from me." The thought made her stomach churn. She didn't know what he wanted, but she knew it couldn't be good. She had to get help. Her phone was useless, no signal, just the blank screen. The storm had taken out the power, leaving her with no way to reach the outside world. All she had were the streets, the dark alleys, and the rain that seemed to pour harder with each passing minute. Maya pushed on, her legs aching from the effort, but she refused to slow down. There was nowhere to hide. There was no one around to hear her if she screamed. She was alone. She stumbled into a small park, the trees a mass of twisted branches overhead, blocking out any light from the moon. The rain had soaked through her clothes, her skin chilled from the cold. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the world was pressing down on her. She needed to find a way to fight back. What would Mom do? Maya thought bitterly, realizing how much she had taken her mother's strictness for granted. If her mom had been here, she would have known exactly what to do. But Maya was alone now. She had to be strong. She ducked behind a bench, trying to catch her breath. Her head spun with dizziness, and the panic was starting to take over again. She was trapped. The fear gnawed at her insides like a ravenous animal, gnawing away every ounce of hope. Get a grip, Maya. Focus. She looked around, hoping for a sign. That's when she heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. No. She froze, barely breathing, her heart in her throat. The footsteps grew louder, until they stopped just in front of her hiding spot. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't find her. She glanced over at the clock. It was almost 9 p.m. Maya wasn't one for horror movies or anything that might keep her awake at night. A good book or a light comedy was more her style. But as the evening wore on, she found herself glancing out the window more often than usual. It was the streetlight that flickered occasionally, casting long shadows across the yard. And she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house was quiet, too quiet. She heard the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of a loose floorboard, but nothing else. It wasn't unusual, but it was unsettling. It wasn't like she had never been alone before. But tonight felt different. After a while, Maya decided to make a snack and turned off the TV. She moved to the kitchen, the floor cool beneath her bare feet as she grabbed some crackers and cheese. She could hear the wind howling outside, a storm brewing. It wasn't unusual for this time of year, stormy nights were common in their town. She turned toward the window to see if the storm had started yet. As she did, her heart stopped for a split second. A shadow. It was standing just outside her window, barely visible through the rain. For a moment, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved. Maya froze. She didn't know what to think. Who would be out there in the middle of the night, in the pouring rain? Maybe a neighbor, or worse, some strange person trying to pull a prank. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to chalk it up to her imagination. But her eyes wouldn't leave the figure standing outside. A tall man. Black suit. Dark as night. His presence seemed so still, almost unnerving. Maya felt her pulse quicken. What if it was someone who meant harm? Her mind raced, but she refused to panic. Her first thought was to call her parents, but she didn't want to worry them. She should have called the police, if something was wrong. But how could she explain it without sounding paranoid? She kept staring at the figure, still rooted to the spot. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. And yet, something about the way it stood there made her blood run cold. Slowly, Maya moved toward the door, her phone in her hand. She dialed her mother's number, only for it to go straight to voicemail. She took a deep breath, glancing back at the window again. The figure was still there. Think, Maya. Think. A quick glance to her right showed the hallway door to the kitchen, the same one that led to the back garden. The door was locked, wasn't it? She thought it was. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had already snuck in? She swallowed hard. The air felt thick and suffocating now. Her skin prickled, every nerve on edge. As she stared at the shadowy figure outside, Maya knew one thing for sure: this night wasn't going to be as quiet as she had hoped. Maya's fingers trembled as she gripped her phone, unsure of what to do. The shadow outside didn't budge. It was as if it was waiting, watching. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest. Every instinct told her to act, but she didn't know how. Her first instinct was to retreat, lock herself in a room and hide until the morning, but something held her in place. She couldn't let herself be paralyzed by fear. Taking a deep breath, Maya forced herself to stay calm. You've dealt with worse, Maya. You're fine. She reminded herself. But the quiet hum of the storm outside seemed to amplify her anxiety. The world beyond the glass felt so much more real, more threatening, than it ever had before. The figure remained still, so still it almost seemed like part of the night itself. She couldn't make out any distinguishing features, just the shadowy outline of a tall figure with broad shoulders, standing rigid like a sentinel guarding the dark. The man was dressed in black, from head to toe, and something about the way his clothes shimmered in the faint moonlight made him seem even more unnatural. Maya had no idea who he was, or what he wanted, but she could feel his gaze, like ice crawling over her skin. She slowly stepped away from the window, trying to move quietly, but her bare feet thudded against the floor like thunder in the stillness. She tried to breathe steadily, but it felt impossible. What do I do now? She glanced toward the front door, then back to the figure outside. Her mind raced, but no solution came. She thought about calling 911, but what would she say? That there was someone standing outside her window? That would be too vague, wouldn't it? They'd just think she was being paranoid, some teenager freaking out over nothing. But then, the figure moved. It wasn't a quick movement, more like a deliberate shifting, a slow turn of his head toward the house. Maya froze, her eyes locking on his silhouette as his gaze seemed to pierce through the darkness and directly into hers. She gasped, her body jerking as if the air had thickened. She instinctively took a step backward, but her foot hit the coffee table, sending it skidding across the floor. The noise felt like a gunshot in the silence. Did he hear it? Does he know I'm here? Maya's breath caught in her throat as the figure's head tilted, almost as if he were listening for something. She pressed herself against the wall, every nerve in her body screaming to run, to hide, to do anything but stay in this wide-open space. The seconds stretched out into what felt like hours. Then, just when Maya thought she couldn't take it anymore, the man took a step toward the house, his dark figure moving across the yard with unnerving precision. Maya could hear his footsteps now, slow, deliberate, echoing in the stillness of the night. Her heart raced as she stared at him, her fingers instinctively clutching her phone in her pocket, knowing she had to do something. "Please, just leave," she whispered to herself, but she knew it was pointless. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't just some random passerby. He was here for a reason. And Maya was beginning to suspect that reason was her. Then, the worst thing happened. The figure walked up to the window. Maya's breath caught in her throat as he positioned himself directly outside the pane. His face was obscured by the darkness, but she could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against her chest. A cold chill swept through her as she stood frozen, praying that he wouldn't notice her. But then, something strange happened. The man leaned in close to the window, his face just inches away from the glass. Maya could make out a faint shape, the edge of his features illuminated by the dim light of the street lamp. His eyes, those cold, empty eyes, seemed to bore into her soul. A surge of panic rose in her throat, but she managed to stay silent, barely daring to breathe. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. It felt as if time itself had frozen in place. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice was low and smooth, almost casual, as if they were having a conversation from the other side of a dinner table. "Don't try to hide, Maya. I'm not going anywhere." The words hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't move, couldn't react. How did he know her name? The shock of hearing her name from his lips made her pulse spike. There was no way he could have known. She was sure she hadn't said it aloud, and yet there it was, hanging in the air like a thread of terror. Maya's mind spun, trying to make sense of the situation. How did he know? Her throat tightened as she swallowed, her whole body shaking. She reached for her phone again, but as her fingers brushed against the screen, the power suddenly cut out. The lights in the room flickered before going completely dark. Her heart leaped into her throat. She was alone in the dark now. Alone with someone who knew her name, who had been watching her, and now, who was only a few steps away. Panic surged as she realized she was no longer safe. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the storm began to lash harder against the house. Maya's thoughts were a blur, her chest tight with terror. She needed to do something, anything, but everything inside her screamed to run. And yet, she didn't. Maya's heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the wind that howled against the house. The lights had gone out, leaving her alone in the eerie silence. It was as though the world outside had vanished, replaced by an inescapable dark void. Her phone screen flickered on again, but there was no signal. Panic set in as she realized she was cut off from the outside world. The intruder was still out there. His footsteps, slow, deliberate, could be heard now, like an echo of a nightmare. A chill crawled up Maya's spine. She had to act, and she had to do it fast. The first thing that came to mind was the front door, but she knew it was locked tight. If she was going to survive this, she had to be smart. Maya backed away from the window, heart racing, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. She could hear the storm intensifying outside, the rain lashing against the windows. The power outage only added to the tension, throwing the house into complete darkness. But she wasn't alone. The dark figure outside was real, and now, he was inside. He knows where I am. Maya's mind screamed at her to move, but she was paralyzed by fear. What if he was already inside? What if he was just waiting for her to make the first move? Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. Maya's heart skipped a beat as she whipped her head toward the stairs. It wasn't the storm. No, this was real. Someone was inside. Her breath quickened, and she froze. Was it him? Was he in the house already? Her mind scrambled for a plan. Think, Maya. You've got this. Then, her gaze fell on the kitchen. The back door. She had left it slightly ajar earlier. It was a mistake she'd soon regret. She didn't want to go down there. Not alone. But it was the only way out. It was her only chance. The sound of footsteps growing louder made her decision for her. She rushed to the stairs, hoping against hope that she could make it to the kitchen without being seen. Each step seemed to echo in the dark, but Maya held her breath, determined not to make a sound. Downstairs, she could see the faint silhouette of the man, moving through the hallway like a shadow among shadows. He was just walking, slowly, methodically, like he was enjoying the terror he was causing. Maya's pulse raced in her throat as she crouched down, hidden behind the wall, her body pressed against the cool wood. She heard him stop, just a few feet away. She didn't dare peek around the corner to see where he was. What is he waiting for? Seconds stretched out in the suffocating darkness, each one heavier than the last. Then, without warning, the sound of heavy breathing broke through the silence, coming from the hallway. Maya's chest tightened. He was close. She couldn't just stay here. She needed to make a move. Taking a deep breath, Maya bolted from her hiding spot. She ran to the kitchen, her bare feet hitting the floor with a muted thud. The wind outside rattled the windows, masking her movements. But as she neared the back door, she heard something that sent her blood cold. The man's voice. Where do you think you're going? Her stomach dropped as she turned toward the voice, and there he was. Standing in the doorway, framed by the darkness, with his cold eyes fixed on her. Maya froze. The door was within reach, but it might as well have been miles away. She felt a wave of nausea hit her as she realized how close he was. Her legs trembled, her knees almost buckling beneath her. The man didn't move, but his gaze was intense, studying her every move. He was toying with her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Maya's breath caught in her throat as he took a single step forward, his figure growing larger in the dark space. Her eyes darted to the counter, searching for something, anything, she could use as a weapon. She grabbed the first thing she saw, a knife. Its handle was cold and foreign in her grip, but it was the only defense she had. The intruder smiled, a cold, menacing grin. I didn't think you would make this easy, but it looks like you will. Maya raised the knife in front of her, her hands shaking as she tried to hold it steady. The intruder just stood there, unmoving. It was as if he wanted her to strike first, to make the first move. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Stay back, she shouted, her voice trembling. He only chuckled, the sound low and guttural, before speaking again. You don't know how this ends, do you? You think a knife will save you? Maya didn't reply. She wasn't sure what to say. All she knew was that she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Suddenly, the sound of a door slamming shut echoed from behind her. It was the front door. Maya's heart skipped a beat. The man turned his head slightly, his gaze flickering for just a moment. That was all the time Maya needed. Without hesitation, she lunged for the back door. Her fingers brushed the handle, her pulse racing as she tried to yank it open. The door stuck for a moment, and in that brief second, she heard him move toward her again. She pulled harder. The door creaked open just wide enough for her to slip through, but as she turned, she felt something cold brush against her wrist. No. She yanked her arm free, tearing away from the man's grip. In a blur of panic, Maya ran into the stormy night, the doors slamming behind her. Maya's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran through the torrential rain, the sound of the storm mingling with the pounding of her heart. The world around her was a blur of shadows and water, the chaos of the night pressing in from every direction. She couldn't think straight. All she knew was that she had to get away.